Europe in 1914 appeared, on the surface, to be the most advanced and powerful region the world had ever seen. Where empires stretched across continents, industries fueled economic growth, and technological progress created a sense that the future belonged to those who controlled it. Yet beneath this image of confidence and stability, a far more dangerous reality was taking shape. As rivalries deepened, alliances hardened, and tensions quietly built toward a breaking point that few truly understood. This was not a continent at peace, but a continent suspended in a fragile balance, where one unexpected event could unravel everything and drag the world into a conflict unlike anything it had ever experienced. How did a continent so advanced, so interconnected, and so seemingly stable move toward total war with such speed and certainty? And why did the leaders of Europe fail to stop a crisis that they could clearly see developing before them? To answer that, we must look beyond the surface of prosperity and examine the forces that were already pulling Europe toward disaster. By the early 20th century, Europe was dominated by powerful empires such as the British Empire, the German Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Russian Empire, and the Ottoman Empire, each of which pursued its own ambitions while remaining deeply suspicious of the other's intentions. These powers were not simply coexisting. They were competing for influence, territory, and prestige in a system where gains by one were often seen as losses by another. This constant rivalry created an environment where trust was limited and strategic calculations dominated decision-making, turning Europe into a landscape of competing interests that could easily spiral into confrontation. In an effort to secure themselves against potential threats, European powers formed complex alliances that were intended to maintain balance and deter aggression. Yet in reality, these agreements created rigid commitments that reduced flexibility in times of crisis. The formation of opposing blocs, including the Triple Entente and the Triple Alliance, meant that any localized conflict carried the risk of triggering a much larger confrontation involving multiple major powers. What was designed as a system of protection gradually became a mechanism of escalation, where diplomatic options narrowed and military responses became increasingly automatic once tensions reached a certain level. As rivalries intensified, European nations began to invest heavily in their military capabilities, expanding armies, increasing conscription, and developing detailed war plans that assumed conflict was not only possible, but likely. The arms race, particularly between naval powers, reflected a broader belief that strength would deter enemies, even as it simultaneously heightened fear and suspicion among competing states. Military planning became so central to national strategy that once mobilization began, it was difficult to reverse, creating a situation in which the momentum toward war could quickly become unstoppable. While political and military structures created the framework for conflict, nationalism provided the emotional and ideological force that made compromise increasingly difficult as people across Europe began to identify strongly with their nations and demand recognition, independence, or expansion. In regions like the Balkans, where multiple ethnic groups lived under imperial rule, these nationalist movements challenged existing authorities and created constant instability. The clash between rising national identities and established empires turned the region into one of the most volatile areas in Europe, where even a small incident could have far-reaching consequences. The fragile balance finally collapsed on June 28, 1914, when Archduke Franz Ferdinand was assassinated in Sarajevo, an event that initially appeared to be a localized political crisis, but quickly escalated due to existing tensions and alliances. Austria-Hungary's response to the assassination set off a chain reaction, as declarations of war and military mobilizations spread rapidly across Europe. What might have remained a regional conflict instead became a global war, as interconnected alliances pulled major powers into a confrontation that none of them could easily escape. Despite the seriousness of the crisis, diplomatic efforts failed to prevent escalation, as leaders feared that backing down would weaken their position or embolden their rivals, while military timetables pushed them toward rapid and irreversible decisions. The combination of rigid alliances, strategic calculations, and misjudgments created a situation in which peaceful solutions became increasingly difficult to achieve. In this environment, war was not so much chosen as it was allowed to happen, driven by a series of decisions that collectively removed the possibility of de-escalation. One of the most striking aspects of Europe on the eve of war was the widespread belief that any conflict would be short, controlled, and decisive, reflecting a profound misunderstanding of modern warfare and its potential consequences. Leaders and military planners underestimated the scale and duration of the conflict they were about to unleash, assuming that existing strategies would deliver quick victories. Instead, these assumptions led to one of the most devastating wars in history, demonstrating how confidence and miscalculation can combine to produce catastrophic outcomes. By 1914, Europe had constructed a system of alliances, rivalries, and military preparations that was inherently unstable, where each component reinforced the others in ways that made conflict increasingly likely. The continent's apparent strength masked underlying weaknesses, including mistrust, competition, and an inability to adapt to changing circumstances. What followed was not simply the result of a single event, but the culmination of long-term forces that had been building for decades. So when we look at Europe on the eve of World War I, we are not just seeing the beginning of a war, but the end of an era, and we must ask ourselves whether the catastrophe that followed was truly avoidable, or whether the system itself had already made it inevitable.